And I'm going to talk about the bit like more instrumental side to the whole TEEB issue, economics of ecosystem biodiversity. In the past weeks, you heard a lot about how business can contribute, what voluntary contributions are available, what can local administrators do, etc. So I'm going to do a step back and from the, say, more traditional realm of environmental economics, what are the possible solutions or element of solutions down there. So if you use the kind of standard phraseology coming from environmental economics, there are basically two issues. There are market failure and policy failure, and biodiversity loss or loss of ecosystems and associated biodiversity resulting from that. Market failure, of course, this is a classical thing, theory of externalities. Why do externalities persist? Because they're elements of public goods, including for biodiversity. Elements of, that's important, it's not a pure public good, but some elements of biodiversity have features of public goods. And then you have the classical approach to, say, at least the simpler environmental problems, economic instruments like Pigouvian taxes, etc., etc., to internalize these externalities. So I'll discuss that under the heading, general heading, positive incentives and regulation. And then I come to the other perspective, saying that biodiversity loss is also a result of policy failure. And what can that mean? Well, in that case, we're talking here in particular about subsidies and their environmentally harmful effects and what you can do about that. So obviously, as you know from economics, there's a certain skeptical attitudes towards regulation, having quite an eminent tradition, if you see from the very old quote. And it has to do with actually that we have two different notions of the term regulation, and that's quite important. I'll dwell on that later on. Also, there is a broad notion when we talk about regulation, meaning actually almost any or certainly any restrictive governmental intervention. And again, we come to the internalization of externality thing where this important strand of environmental economics said, okay, we need to do something about it from the government, such as Pigouvian tax, environmental taxes, etc., etc. And then there is, of course, the narrower definition or narrower approach of the notion, and that has to do with this debate many of you might already heard about, this command versus command and control instruments versus market-based or economic instruments. So regulation is then identified as these kind of command and control instruments, which for a number of reasons are seen as a bit like crude or not flexible enough, etc. I'm coming back to that. So the scope of regulation, it's about setting emissions, performance, or management standards. It's about restrictions on product use. It's about also, that's very important, spatial planning, restricting land use, establishing protected areas. This is all a kind of regulation. And you talked, I think, in the past weeks about the details on establishment of protected areas, protected area management, etc., etc. So, and the question now is, as a first step, where's the delineation between regulation as a restrictive governmental intervention and voluntary approaches? And in particular with regard to our topic, biodiversity conservation, conservation and sustainable use. So this is a nice graph developed by Patrick, the editor of the whole TEEB volume on policy making for policymakers. If you look at it coming from a situation where you have some environmental damage to biodiversity, to ecosystem services, etc., you might have a situation, ideal situation, where you have absolutely no control, right? But then, even from a purely private perspective, it might actually be useful and perfectly rational to do some mitigation avoidance activities, costly mitigation avoidance activities. And then you would get to what we might call a private optimum, even in the absence of any legal requirements or any state interventions, right? Mind you, that might not necessarily come about automatically because, say, if we talk about a farmer, he might not necessarily have all the information or the technologies available for, say, erosion control by some features of ecosystems. So he might not necessarily do it. There might still be perhaps some policy space to help the farmer doing it, but nothing going beyond some capacity building, certainly not regulation in the narrow sense. So then you can have some legal requirements kind of spelling out a reference level, and then that would be based on some regulatory instrument, which would lead, for instance, to the application of the polluter pays principle, and then you might come to a private solution with legal requirements. So there are some regulations around, or some even economic instruments, etc. But that might not necessarily be your environmental targets. Why is that? Well, this is a nice feature, or from a scientific viewpoint, a nice feature of biodiversity. It's fairly complex, and many aspects of biodiversity are actually kind of embedded with private property rights. And obviously, the state has only limited powers to interfere with private property rights. Could otherwise constitute what I think in the US it's called a regulatory taking, right? So you might have environmental objectives, but by simple government fiat, regulation, economic instruments, you can also do so much. So then there comes these voluntary approaches, like payments for ecosystem service programs, where you would perhaps offer farmers or forest owners further payments for their continued provision of ecosystem services, even beyond these kind of legal requirements, the legal reference level. So that's the kind of ideal delineation between regulatory approaches and voluntary approaches. And of course, the political, that's what we said here, the practical or political feasible environmental optimum at the time, that might not necessarily lead to no impact. I mean, if we were already at the upper frontier, then we wouldn't have a biodiversity problem, right? So the remaining green square there, this is the costs which continue to be borne by society. And sorry for the typo. Procedurally, I forgot to ask you, whenever you have a question or you feel that I'm utterly incomprehensible, please don't be shy to ask right away, okay? So the question is then, why to regulate and how to regulate? And using, again, these two notions I introduced here, the broad notion and the narrow notion, command control versus market-based instruments. Why would we, as a state, as a government, introduce some crude standards directly prescribing individual instead of introducing a smart environmental tax where everyone is optimizing at the margin? Why would we do that? Well, there might be, for instance, situations where the regulatees, the guys who are going to be regulated by the state, they might be relatively homogeneous, right? Little difference between producers that kind of, say, pollute, for instance. So in that case, if they're pretty similar, then there will be no little gains from trade anyways. So why should we introduce a sophisticated, for instance, tradable permit scheme when a simple regulatory standard would also do? This is one of the aspects, what they call the economics of relatively simple tools. This in particular applies when you have many sources, tiny and mobile pollution sources. Wouldn't be really practical to have kind of tradable permit schemes or something like that for your exhaust fumes coming from your cars, right? Instead, you simply go ahead and prescribe specific standards, minimum standards for cars. Sometimes, of course, there is simply a need for what they call corner solutions here, right? Those of you who did environmental economics, you know that typically we assume these nice curvatures and then you have an inner optimum, right? But if we talk about, say, hazardous substances, it doesn't really make sense, right? We don't want to have, it wouldn't make sense to tax plutonium because we simply don't want it to be around in the environment. So in that sense, on that case, regulation would do better. And of course, there are kind of what I call technical issues here, and this is particularly interesting from a biodiversity perspective, because biodiversity is such a complex beast. As I said, it has aspects of public goods to it, has aspects of private goods to it, and it's typically non-homogeneous. So it's very difficult to tax biodiversity consumption or landscape consumption. It's possible to tax sulfur dioxide emissions, but for biodiversity we have to come up with something more like smarter. So we don't have a tax base, unlike for homogeneous pollutants. And of course we might in many cases, again, not necessarily want to have an inner optimum. That's what's called non-convexities, right? Again, going back to the curvatures. Sometimes we need, in a sense, extreme solutions. One plot of land where nothing happens, where you have 100% conservation, and another plot of land with a fair distance in between, where a lot of things happen, a lot of economic activity with potential negative impacts. But the most interesting solution is actually to separate the two by way of spatial planning and by establishment of protected areas. And this is all going beyond the traditional realm of, say, thinking about environmental economics in terms of emissions taxation. But for biodiversity, that's a very important aspect. And then, of course, the third aspect, and the one I want to dwell on a bit further, is the whole notion of use regulation, but make it smarter by introducing some add-ons, make regulation smarter. So, for instance, you can have minimum standards, but then you add something to make it smarter. And how that can look like, we are going to look at in a minute. And of course, from an economic perspective, what's interesting is that you can actually doing add-ons and enhance efficiency. And the typical thing is, of course, tradability. So have tradable permits, tradable conservation credits, etc. So just as a case example, I thought I'd pick one. As I said, I'm going to dwell on this. I dwell on which might be where you might be quite familiar with this. This is this whole instrument, offsets, biodiversity offsets, biodiversity banks. So this is my knowledge, not being from the US. There might be some details to fill in here, so if you feel that I get something wrong here, please tell me. But this is how I know it works. So there is a section under the Clean Waters Act where you actually have to get a permit whenever you discharge dredged or filled materials into waters of the United States. And there's a certain history to that. But the nice thing, what one would not necessarily think of in the first glance is that waters that includes wetlands. And then, of course, that becomes very relevant for biodiversity conservation. So when you want to do that, and essentially this is relevant for almost any development proposed taking place in wetlands or close to wetlands, you have to get a permit. I think the regulating agency is the US Army Corps of Engineers. And then the granting of the permit requires that the permittee adheres to this mitigation sequence. So he needs to take all practicable steps to avoid impacts, avoidance. What cannot be avoided needs to be mitigated, has to be minimized. And then the remaining damage, and that's the interesting thing, is to be compensated by compensatory measures, compensatory mitigatory measures near site or even off site. And the whole idea is that you would implement, you can still, if you allow the development in the first place, compensatory mitigation would contribute to no net loss of wetlands. So the question now is how to implement that. In the beginning, when that started, in fact, the individual developers went ahead and tried to, restore a degraded wetland which wasn't too far away. And then you ended up with many kind of squatted little restoration plots. And that led to further thinking, and then there came up this idea with wetland mitigation banking, where you can restore or establish or enhance specific larger wetland areas in advance. And then you can set them aside to compensate for further conversions. And the interesting thing is that it's actually a business model, because many of these wetland mitigation banks that have been established were established by entrepreneurs, by private actors. So the idea is then, if you propose a development project and you go through the first two steps, and then you look around just for the last step, for the compensatory mitigation, you can purchase credit from this mitigation bank. And the price or the value of the credit is determined by quantifying the wetland functions or acres restored or created. So it's based on acreage, but there are also fairly extensive regulations with regard how the ecosystem functions of the wetlands have to be restored. So the EPA has a fairly detailed amount of booklets and guidance brochures, etc., etc. I just looked them up the other week. So yeah, you got a question?
Yeah, I'm not familiar at all with this, so I wanted to understand more about the compensatory mitigation that you were talking about.
Yes.
The EPA will be compensating.
No, the project developer. The project developer has to go through these three steps: avoidance, yes, right, by project design. And then the impacts that cannot be avoided have to be mitigated to the extent feasible on the site. And then there might be some damage left on the site, right? I mean, if you have a development, typically it will have a footprint even if you do the first two steps. And this footprint or this remaining damage has to be compensated by the developer. So in the case of a wetland, say for instance you propose a development, it could be a housing development for instance, or a factory or whatever, and you have some unavoidable harm. Some degradation will happen. You will cut off some plots, etc. Say out of the 20 acres of wetland, 5 will unavoidably be destroyed. Well, then you have to go ahead and restore somewhere else a degraded wetland, and you might not even have to restore just 5 because it's already restored. So EPA will say to you, you have to restore 10 or 15, right? That's the idea behind compensatory mitigation. And then, as I said, instead of having the individual developers doing this, which was the way it was done when this program was implemented first, the idea came up to kind of get this together into these kind of mitigation banks.
And that's voluntary. It's a voluntary market. So the financer who originally restored the wetland is the one who's then compensated by the developer's project. It's not going to the government. It's a private market thing.
Well, in a sense, this is the thing. That's what I said. It's still regulation, but there is an add-on here. As an individual developer, as far as I know, you don't have to go to the mitigation bank. So if you find a smart compensatory mitigation project nearby to your site, then you can still do it. But you have to do this third step. That's the important thing. This is mandatory. But how you do it, that might be your choice. And then, of course, these mitigation banks, they provide some more flexibility, and the usual thing is that we would expect a more efficient solution. So here there are some of the advantages that were identified by biodiversity banks. So increase the size of remaining small ecosystem patches. That's what I said, this consolidation, reduce ecosystem fragmentation. And also to secure more reliable biodiversity outcomes, because, as I said, these biodiversity, these wetland banks are created in advance. So in a sense, they are already there. And then you can buy in, or developers can buy in later. And of course, for the developers, that's advantageous, because you know for sure that if that bank was already established and approved by the EPA, then it's for sure that whatever you go there, buy a credit, that will be approved by EPA as well. Yes, and this is, of course, as I said, efficiency. Because banks have these economies of scale, larger plots instead of many large plots, etc., and you have many banks around, so you have some competition, you would expect that you have a kind of more cost effectiveness in achieving the environmental goal, that goal of no net loss. So this is a typical example where you would still have regulation in the narrow sense. In a sense, it's still, kind of command and control, but then you ease it up, you make it more flexible by introducing this kind of trading scheme. Here are two examples where that take place. As I said, in the US, I think the US started with that, actually. We have now 4 wetland banks, a market of more than 3 billion per year, not too bad. And Australia's habitat banking system, there started fairly recently. The interesting thing is that the number of countries worldwide is very limited doing this kind of stuff. Wetland banking for sure, but even applying that compensatory mitigation, these kind of mitigation hierarchy by law to developments, that's just 30 odd states in the world doing this kind of thing. Of course, it has been criticized in particular by some environmental NGOs, mainly because they were suspicious about two things. First, whether that would not lead to a backdoor that you always approve projects. Of course, I mean, in principle, a project can still be so bad that the regulatory agency should simply reject it. But if you have all these kind of nice flex-in mechanisms here, there was a suspicion, or there is maybe still a suspicion, that may lead to, say, the agency approving almost every project. To answer this, you need to do a decent empirical study, so I can't pronounce myself on the validity of that argument, but it has been still around. And then, of course, there are concerns about this on-site, off-site thing, because if the ecosystem or the kind of species, species associated with the ecosystem are fairly unique, then wouldn't you compensate apples for oranges? That's another important, potentially very important point that was made. So when we had this discussion in TEEB, we came up with this little kind of a graph where you can actually identify as kind of an area where, in fact, this kind of offsetting mechanism is not really inappropriate. When you have high unique endemic species, say, ecosystem with high endemisms, something very difficult to compensate, right? Unless you really know about the ecosystem functions and the fact that, yes, other species can contribute to the same ecosystem functions, etc., etc. And losing unique species is always critical. So then you might really wonder whether you should do compensation. So if we move on to from there to more like the standard stuff, market-based instruments, right? Taxes, fees, charges, tradable permit schemes, etc., etc. Well, what they do is, this is just the standards here. I put them up nevertheless. They change incentives and decision making, yes, of course, and they have this kind of built-in nice thing that they achieve cost effectiveness under a specific objective. They directly implement the polluter or user pays principle. They go towards the internalization of external cost. Of course, I mean, environmental tax is not necessarily Pigouvian tax, as you know, but at least we achieve, as I said, the targets in a cost-efficient way. So we have these potential cost savings when compared with emission standards, for instance. And of course, that's important from a kind of environmental fiscal reform perspective. It generates public revenue. So, and then there was this idea discussed quite intensely in some 10, 15 years ago that you might actually shift the tax burden from labor to the environment, in a sense. Yeah. So the idea was reduce income taxes or other important taxes and then go for environmental taxes, because it's you know, you want to internalize anyways, and the tax revenue you can use by reducing the tax burden on other taxes. And of course, that might have positive impacts on employment, et cetera, et cetera. So you had this huge discussion about what this double dividend of doing this. Interestingly, it somewhat stalled, right? I mean, the environmental taxes are around in a fair amount of OECD countries, but it's still fairly small. So even, say, the Netherlands, which are Netherlands, Denmark, top on the list here, they're below 10% of all the tax receipts. That's not much. Of course, from a biodiversity perspective, as I said, there are limitations to these kind of instruments as a direct tool for biodiversity conservation sustainable use. I mean, if you look at, say, taxes on gas, I mean, in a sense, it would certainly be helpful for biodiversity conservation in an indirect way, right? Less cars, less roads, et cetera, but it's indirect. In a second, I'm talking about a bit on tradable permit schemes in fisheries. Again, fish, that's fairly homogeneous, right? Fish of a certain species, commercial species. So, and it's related to biodiversity, obviously, but it's just one tiny aspect of marine biodiversity. And then, of course, in designing these kind of things, yes, valuation can improve the design calibration. And this kind of economic information can be used then to determine the adequate tax rate or price, right? So here's what I said: individual transferable quotas in fisheries management. And there are actually two steps here. The first thing is that, you know, fisheries, traditionally common pool resource, have some inherent problems in there which fishery authorities tried to address through a number of regulatory approaches. And the standard problem is the race for fish, right? If you have no regulation at all, every fisherwoman tries to take the fish out first, right? And the interesting thing is that under some regulatory approaches, this problem will persist. So if you have a fishing season, then they go all out with their boats and try to get as many fish as possible, and then you have to narrow down the period for the fishing season as your resource gets more and more under threat. Gear restrictions, right? Then you had this kind of regulatory approaches trying to restrict the gear or the vessel capacity. And then you got this cat and mouse play between the regulatory agency and the inventiveness of the fisher folk, trying to come up with still another technical means to get out as many fish as possible. So the nice and fairly innovative in the time approach was to provide fishers with defined rights within a given fishery based on total allowable catch for the entire fishery. So you would assign catch shares, that's the general name for that. That's already a huge step forward, because then you actually make a big step towards solving or addressing this race to the fish problem. And then in addition, you can make these catch shares tradable to account for, technological differences between the fisher folk, etc., etc. And then again, you can enhance efficiency because you allow gains from trade to be realized. So this is actually, that's an interesting thing here. This is actually a fairly old story. Resource economists, fishery economists have been advocating ITQs for, I don't know, when I was studying, that was already standard textbook fare. And it's interesting to see the time lap between this kind of fairly standard economic wisdom and the application and implementation and actual management. Thing is that many policymakers don't really listen to economists. Or it takes a long time to get that message down. Now you have a fairly significant and increasing number of fisheries applying catch shares, and some even using full-blown ITQs. So what's nice that you have now the empirical information at hand to really do an empirical assessment, right? I mean, it's, as I said, policymakers rarely believe economic theories, but they might be more inclined to believe a solid empirical study. So I was referring here to one article in Science 2008, which actually did just that. They empirically assessed a large amount of fisheries. They put it into a database, both the actual catch statistics and the institutional, the management arrangement in place. And they came up with fairly solid empirical conclusion that yes, in fact, implementation of catch shares halts and even reverses the global trend towards fishery collapse. And in addition, it may also improve compliance and participation management. So that's actually, again, quite a nice story, and again, an example where you can address some aspects of biodiversity by smart regulation. Of course, monitoring and enforcement, this is more like for being comprehensive here. This is always a problem, right? I mean, it's, mind you, it's still by government, even if it's smart, even if you have markets, it's still by government fiat. So the individual fisher folk might always have an incentive to cheat. However, it's also probably true that the incentive to cheat is even higher if you just penalize. Because if you provide positive incentives, you still have the incentives to cheat under positive incentives, because you can take the positive incentives and still do your harmful activity, right? It's not going away, the problem is not going away, but it might be less. There might be less inclined. New approaches to approach cases of non-compliance. Again, interestingly, in the past, you had many environmental regulations which led to kind of unexpected outcomes. And economic thinking can actually help you in perhaps prevent these unexpected outcomes. The standard example happened in many developing countries when you had elephants human-wildlife conflicts, right? So maybe you have big forest, elephants are living there or some other wildlife, and then you have farmers nearby, and you had conflict, and the government wanted to preserve the wild species. What they did was typically to introduce regulation forbidding the farmers to do anything about that, to not interfere, right? And then they had the typical monitoring enforcement constraints, basically no capacity in place for properly monitor and enforce that regulation. And the thing is, in many instances, this wildlife is really a big nuisance, right? Elephants go into your fields, trample them down, and eat the harvest. So the typical approach by farmers was what was called shoot, shovel, and shut up. And remarkably, this was not expected initially by the regulator. So, and then eventually, once they realized the problem, then they came up with, you know, these additional schemes. And again, economic thinking can help to design these schemes in a useful way, such as compensation schemes for wildlife damage, etc., etc. And of course, for many environmental or biodiversity issues, the issue is actually transboundary. Monitoring is transboundary. Enforcement needs to be transboundary. So you need this international collaboration. And then I found that nice opportunity to put a nice slide on my employer, the United Nations or the CBD, and talk about the role of international law and multilateral environmental agreements in general. And as we see, this is one of their role to address these kind of transboundary monitoring enforcement issues. But here's just a couple of empirical information. We have an awful lot of them around. If you count really the really small scale regional or maybe even sub-regional agreements, we might have over 500. Nobody knows their exact number probably. But of course we have the biggies, huh? And I mentioned the 3 Rio conventions here, the ones that were signed and adopted at the Rio conference, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio in 1992. And my convention, the CBD, is one of them, together with the conventions to combat desertification and climate change. And then specifically for the biodiversity realm, we have these 5 here, the global biodiversity conventions. CBD, CITES, migratory species, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, and the World Heritage Convention under UNESCO. It's a fairly diverse lot doing completely different things and doing these completely different things in a completely different manner. Quite interesting. Let's have a look at, try to categorize a bit what these guys are doing. Of course, the idea is that whenever you have a transboundary or regional or global issue, then yes, states need to come together and agree on some stuff to do about it. And there's of course the notion, yes, environmental assets as an international public good. Climate change or the global climate is the kind of standard example. But then distinct from that, there might be actually also a need for these kind of treaties whenever you have this need for transboundary enforcement. So whenever you need to ensure compliance across borders, even if the problem itself is, or put it otherwise, even if it's just the national interest alone to do something about that. So in that case, it's maybe a national public good, but not necessarily an international one. But the compliance issue might be an international issue. Important example I put here is CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. So the idea is whenever trade contributes to further endanger or threaten endangered species, You need to do something about it. And what CITES does is essentially is a permit system and restricting permits depending on the degree of threat to the species. But the important thing is that this CITES certificate is then used for checking, monitoring, and enforcement across borders. And that's a unique global system for permits. Mind you that preserving an individual species of wildlife, that's national interest, is not necessarily global public good. Nevertheless, the enforcement issue is international in dimension. So that's why you need the convention. It's actually, that's why I put these two distinct issues here. So this is the kind of standard thing, the first thing people think about when they think about environmental law. But the point I wanted to make is that actually they are also helpful for other stuff. What I call, they provide a platform for cooperation. First of all, to agree on the detail on what needs to be done, including on substantial or procedural standards, etc. And then this is important, going back to this global public good thing, from a naive economic perspective, it's actually surprising that these MEAs are agreed on in the first place, because if it's public good, a global public good, then everyone has a dominant incentive to free ride, right? Isn't it? So why does it come about in the first place? Well, we have more sophisticated economic theories that can also explain that, but it's less surprising from an economic perspective, or from that economic perspective, that MEAs often don't really work that well, right? As you all know, I mean, it's just newspaper knowledge. So it's good still to have them to provide a visible platform for international commitments, because then at least later on NGOs can go and blame lazy governments, and you might have some, reputational loss if everything works well from the environment perspective. But they're also helpful to establish in-depth mechanisms for implementation, including for monitoring and enforcement. Relating back to the second point here, the second point above, under 1, transboundary enforcement. And this is the last point. This is important in particular for the CBD. The CBD is really a kind of global framework convention. So the provisions in the CBD are fairly general because that's a big world. People are doing different things in different corners of the world. And what's useful is to have this platform to exchange experiences and implementation, learning from each other, right? Identifying good practices, lessons learned, etc., etc. In particular, given that we have these kind of fairly different regulatory and policy approaches throughout the globe, I mentioned earlier that these biodiversity offset policies, which are fairly standard in the US and a couple of other states, are still fairly innovative and new to the bulk of states of the globe. So there is still considerable, say, leeway for learning from each other and to realize gains from trade, from learning in a sense. This is the work on incentive measures under the CBD, and the important thing is that this little article here, this serves as the kind of entry point to the economic work under the convention. But you see it's fairly general, and note the little almost disclaimer here, as far as possible and as appropriate. Of course, that's what they say is here incentive measures, meaning, for instance, economic instruments. That's not for everyone, and it's not for every situation. But then you can spell out and try to find out what is the situation where it is appropriate. And that's what the CBD is doing under its program of work on incentive measures, and what we do at the international level, organize these exchange of experiences, etc., etc. And TEEB, the whole process of TEEB as an international initiative, contribute to that. That's how it linked into the CBD, and the TEEB results were then taken up in the CBD. So, this is what I wanted to say on regulation. And now let's turn to that important other thing. Not market failure, but policy failure. Before I do so, is there any... No, huh? You're fine, huh? Yeah, no.
I have one question.
Yeah.
So you're saying there's not very many states that have these biodiversity kind of voluntary bond industry markets, like the wetland mitigation, banking, and this kind of thing. But there's, in the same way that there's this potential for climate change to have a global framework with a carbon trade system and credits being split between places that have been responsible for destruction of biodiversity in the past and places that have biodiversity now, there could be a similar kind of global framework, sort of similar to like the Kyoto for climate change, but for biodiversity, if there were more states that were to establish these kinds of biodiversity banks.
You know what? We are thinking about that. Yes. There are two aspects here. The first aspect is, can you really do these biodiversity offsets on an international or global or at least transboundary manner? Again, right, the kind of initial or immediate answer is, by many people, is say, sound skepticism because of this uniqueness aspect of biodiversity. And the risk that you might trade, I don't know, pandas for tigers, which of course you could not or you should not do. But having said that, there might perhaps be opportunities to further expand or scale up this kind of thing. There is an initiative looking into this, and we as the Secretariat, we were also involved in the debate. It's called, let me just think these acronyms. I come back to you on that. I'm blocked here. But as I said, there is an initiative looking into this issue and trying to come up with a kind of international scheme, perhaps trading scheme for biodiversity offsets, and also trying to look into how you could have some pilot cases bringing a couple of countries together. Remember me, I need to come back to that. Now, subsidies, reforming subsidies. I put up this nice OECD quote, which in a sense brings about the main message of my talk here. And here's the structure, what I want to do. So let's have a first look at what is actually a subsidy. And if you look at this closer, it's actually not easy to come up with a definition, and maybe it's not possible to come up with one single definition. Globally, you have a couple of established definitions from OECD, Statistics Division of the UN, and the WTO, but you have differences among them, quite remarkable differences. The one difference is whether it's just for producers or whether it's also for consumers under some circumstances. The second difference is whether it's just payment or whether it's more than payments. You see, the Statistic Division definitions talks just about payments. That's very narrow. OECD is rather broad. It talks about any government action that confers an advantage. WTO talks about a financial contribution, which is again a bit narrow. But the financial contribution can also be a tax rebate, for instance. But a tax rebate is not a payment, strictly speaking. So you see the differences here. Of course, these definitions were all designed for the specific purposes of the organizations involved. So for the TEEB study, we adopted a fairly broad definition, but of course we need to be clear that it's a fairly loaded term, right? subsidy. You need to think critically about the agenda, the subsidy reform agenda. In particular, when you talk about consumer subsidies, healthcare, big topic in the US. Is that a subsidy or is it not? I'm not providing an answer, right? I'm coming from Canada, mind you. So as I said, for TEEB we adopted a fairly broad subsidy definition or conceptualization. I'm coming back to that. What's important to realize is that they come in many shapes and forms. Talk about direct transfer of funds, but also potential direct transfer, right? A liability restriction for nuclear accidents. That was the pet talk of my fellow Patrick. We did both a chapter, and he was fairly adamant on this one. But it can also be, as I said, tax exemption, tax rebates, tax credits for fuel in particular, low interest loans and guarantees, preferential treatment, use of regulatory support mechanisms, demand quotas, trade barriers, tariffs can act like a subsidy. And then, of course, implicit income transfer where natural resources or services are not priced at full cost. They're not even talking about external cost here, talking about provisioning cost, right? Cost of piping clean water to the consumer. So if you come to an evaluation of subsidy, what we have to realize, and in the TEEB we said, okay, we're not going to put out the baby with the bathwater, and we say we will acknowledge that this is the main tool of governments to dole out money, to do good things. But the question really is whether the subsidy helps to serve towards the intended purpose, the intended policy objective. And we have many instances where the policy objectives aren't that clear in the first place, but even if the proclaimed policy objectives are there, you can pinpoint fairly easily that the subsidy doesn't really contribute to that. I provide an example later on. Then, of course, the question is about efficiency, at what cost, how are cost and benefit distributed, and then for us, of particular relevance, are there any harmful consequences for the environment? What's important to say here is that we do have many green subsidies, right? I mean, payment programs for purposely green objectives, environmental objectives. And in principle, that these assessment criteria need to be applied to green subsidies as well. Now, environmental harmful subsidies, what we said here, we used the OECD definition, and then we said, okay, but in doing so, we have an environmentally harmful effect. How can that come along, that environmental harmful effect? There are actually two general mechanisms. Typically, many subsidies actually provide a reduction for input costs or increased revenues. And consumer subsidies lead then to the below cost pricing for the use of the natural resource in question. And then this in turn leads to incentives for the increased use of subsidized resources, increased production consumption level, increased environmental damage. Here's some numbers on globally. Oh, this is actually a mistake. Well, no, not really. But you need to look careful. Huh? Don't think that the 261 billion per year, this is all environmentally harmful subsidies. This is all subsidies. But then I said, you see, 51 of those, so roughly 130 billion, sorry, increased production. So, because they're tied to inputs or increased revenue to farmer, etc. So in that sense, there is a strong suspicion that there might be some environmentally harmful impact behind that. Same for fisheries. Bulk of the fishery subsidies contribute to overcapacity, and then as I will argue later on, overcapacity, that's identified as being an important driver of declining fish stocks, etc., etc. Of course, we do have conceptual data challenges. These are estimates, but they're, in particular in agriculture, fisheries, energy, these are fairly good and fairly recent estimates. For water, unfortunately, I didn't find a particularly recent one. So there we have more of a challenge. Where we also have a challenge is that in identifying, quantifying the exact impact of the harmful subsidy on the ecosystem services and on biodiversity. First of all, because we have different price elasticities on different markets. So if you want to come up with a solid number, then that's difficult. Then you have also this leakage issue where, subsidized sectors, the effects leak on to other sectors or other markets, and to identify the entire effect then is fairly challenging because it can go away from the initial market. And then, of course, there is the genuinely scientific problem that ecosystem functioning is still not fully understood. So we don't really know to what extent, say, specific degradation in ecosystems lead to a specific degradation in ecosystem functioning and ecosystem services. And last but not least, there are a couple of intervening factors, including policy factors. So there might be actually policy measures in place which kind of mitigate the harmful impacts. And if we don't take those into consideration, then we might actually overemphasize the environmental impacts. So this is kind of the conceptual difficulties if we want to come up with a specific number or specific quantification of the effect of subsidies on biodiversity. What's important to note is, in general terms, is that the size of the subsidy does not necessarily reflect the extent of its harmful effect, meaning that small subsidies can actually have a big impact. In the TEEB study, we had the example of bottom trawling. The subsidies for bottom trawling are actually fairly low. It's 2-digit millions, I think, but the environmental impact of bottom trawling, of course, is huge. So here's a nice number of nice cases on subsidies which are actually not very effective or targeted against their objectives. You look at fuel subsidies, energy subsidies. Often what's said that you help the poor, right? Subsidies are given because you want to do some poverty alleviation or do simply social policy. And the interesting thing is that in many cases, the subsidies are actually a subsidy for the middle class. And yes, the poor also profit from them, but disproportionately lower than the middle classes. So we have that study here from the World Bank, and the numbers are actually fairly nice. And of course, those subsidies that do not even fulfill their objectives, then and they might have environmentally harmful effects. You could argue that those might be nice candidates for privatized reform. So just a couple of slides on subsidies in select sectors: agriculture, fisheries, water. I said it's difficult to quantify, but at least we can point at the kind of main drivers coming from subsidies. And in case of agriculture, it's actually fairly neat. It's intensification and it's expansion. So intensification, you have this kind of bullet list here: loss of non-target species as a byproduct that you want to kill pests, and then all the birds drop off the trees and these kind of things. And then expansion. Expansion is a bit more difficult. Of course, the standard thing is that you expand areas into forests, expand the agricultural frontier, etc. So, and if you're losing more natural ecosystems, then it leads to ecosystem degradation. Vice versa, you would expect that if we reduce the subsidy, that would then lead to agricultural contraction, and eventually if you put conservation policies in place, you could actually restore degraded ecosystems. So in that sense, you might have positive impacts for ecosystems and biodiversity. The interesting twist in the debate here is that that might not always be the case, because we actually may have extensive farming regions where traditional farming practices play a key role in preserving some aspects of agricultural biodiversity. And if those are taken out of construction, you may actually lose biodiversity. So we talk about these high nature value farmlands here, and I provided some examples. So you have a certain policy challenge, right? If you reduce subsidies, agricultural subsidies, yes, you can gain if you put conservation policies in place, but you also need to make sure that you preserve these kind of high nature value farmlands, and in that case you need actually to ensure ongoing agricultural production there. So there's a certain policy challenge in meeting two objectives. On agricultural subsidies, we can actually see some progress in reform, and it has to do with the fact that in the past 2 decades, 15 years, there has been a kind of ongoing effort by many governments to decouple agricultural subsidies. What's meant with that is that instead of having subsidies which that are directly linked to inputs or outputs, you provide subsidies in a way that which are decoupled from agricultural production. That's the idea. For instance, general income support, that would be decoupled from production. So presumably would be less environmentally harmful. And that has actually taken place, and you can see that fairly well in the OECD statistics, where the coupled support, the share of the coupled support went down quite substantially in the last 20 years. Together with also the share of support in total farm revenues. However, that later number, of course, you also need to take into account that we had rising food prices, and that might actually be the single most important aspect to that, not necessarily progress on the reform side. Obviously, more needs to be done. The progress is uneven among countries, but also, you see, even if we have 51 is still coupled to production, that's still an enormous amount. Right? It's still as I said, 130 billion US dollars per year. It's quite a lot of money. And because of that sheer amount, it's also important to note that this decoupling will never be complete. If you look at the analytical, the analysis undertaken by OECD, they point out that if you have really big number, you always have an effect on production, even if it's formally, not tied to your inputs or outputs. Fisheries. Well, I guess you all know about the dire data with regard to global fish stocks. And the important thing is that, yes, subsidies contribute to that, in particular those that are capacity enhancing, so enhancing the capacity of fishing fleet. So I provided a couple of examples here what subsidies do for fleet expansion, modernization, grants, low interest loans, etc., etc. And what's also a major chunk and related to the energy side is tax preferences for fuel, in particular for fishing vessels. That's actually an important, in many countries, an important aspect. And these fisheries subsidies really have they can really have a fairly detrimental impact. And the interesting thing is, even from a purely financial perspective, In a couple of EC countries, fishery subsidies are higher in the country than the actual landing revenue. So subsidy to the fishing sector is more than what the fish is actually worth on the market, the fish harvested and landed in that particular country. This is quite interesting economic data. This is, by the way, I didn't put that here, but it's from the EC White Book on fisheries. Water. Yeah, as I said, water is actually, the bulk here is not even internalization, but it's below cost pricing, or even free provisioning of water. And of course, that can lead to overuse of water, simply waste of water, and it's a particular concern, of course, in arid or semi-arid areas. When water is available, plentiful, might not be the best way to do it from a financial management perspective, perhaps, but then it's more like of a limited problem. And mind you that water saving, if you save too much, then can actually have detrimental impacts. You have raising costs because the sewer starts to sink in summer, right? If you don't have enough water running through it, you may have higher maintenance problem. You may actually need to flush it with water, etc., etc. So there are some interesting twists here, but certainly in many developing countries, in arid and semi-arid areas, it can lead to important problems. Not necessarily only in developing countries. I mean, southern Spain has severe problems with water shortages, etc. And also, it's another nice example where even the proclaimed objective, again, help the poor, right, the urban poor. Most of the urban poor in developing countries don't have access to piped water in the first place. So in a sense, you know, these water below cost pricing water is really a subsidy to the middle class again. And then in developing countries, it can actually lead to cash-strapped utilities then, and they don't have enough water, not enough money to expand their network to the slums. So it's in developing countries and in arid and semi-arid areas, you can make a fairly strong point about that. And irrigation subsidies are particularly concerning, obviously, from a biodiversity perspective. Energy, I wanted to mention that here because it's such an important subsidy component. But of course, for fossil fuels, the impact on biodiversity is only indirect, right? Through climate change, etc., etc. There is the important case of biofuel subsidies. I just put that here as a bullet because that to treat that decently, you need an own lecture. It depends on so many things: the generation of biofuels, what kind of crop you use, etc., etc. But you can say that many subsidies provided, in particular in OECD countries, merit further scrutiny, let's put it that way. And you can also say that maize is not the best crop to produce biofuels, that's for sure. So, against that, wow, some reform efforts are taking place, but it's really, really very slow and very protected. And of course, that has to do with the political economy of subsidy reform. It can also have to do, in some circumstances, with technological and institutional barriers, informational barriers. Governments are doing so many things and having so many programs, and it's often very difficult or challenging to disentangle the different effects of different programs, and even the stated policy objectives are rarely clear. The typical approach is that it has been around for 20 years and many people are happy with that, and it's not exactly sure why are you doing it, but the stakeholders are happy, etc., etc. So you continue doing it, right? So that's why we said that actually an important first step is to do a decent subsidy inventory and then an assessment on the different effects and trying to disentangle the different effects, including on the environment. We do have the OECD worked on that extensively in the past 10, 15 years, and we do have existing guidance and checklists, etc., for governments or government officials who are keen to move on that. Barriers to reform, there's of course vested interests, right? I mean, that goes without saying. But often, mind you, it's often different to disentangle what's really just lobbying and what's genuine and honest concerns about stakeholders who are going to lose. Right? We talk about fisheries subsidies. Do you really let the fishery villages there go astray and they just go under? Or do you do something about it? Maybe some decent training or relocation programs, etc., etc. So whatever, not everything you might come up with as a kind of compensatory program if you phase out the subsidy is just for the purpose of giving more pork to the entrenched stakeholders. And then, of course, there are these genuine political considerations, development prerogatives, food security. And you have to face, sometimes you face trade-offs. You need to think hard about that. You had a look, as I said, there are a number of interesting and successful cases of policy reform, subsidy reform, and even complete subsidy removal. And you can draw some lessons learned from that. This is based, that was the bulk of the OECD work I mentioned. So here are kind of standard lessons learned for successful reform. Of course, you need to have, yes, a transparent definition of policy objectives and a long-term plan. This ambitious endpoints, but timetables for reform might be cautious. Of course, this can also mean that you give another extension, etc., etc. This is why we actually put also here, use political windows of opportunity. It's quite interesting. You find success stories for both cases. The New Zealand case, where they really removed agriculture and fisheries subsidies, that was like a big bang solution. They did that in a couple of years, and the underlying factors was that they had a huge economic crisis and essentially couldn't pay it anymore. So they got a change of government, and it was a bit like, as I said, a nice political window of opportunity. But you don't necessarily need to have that, and that's why I put the Norwegian case, which was much also on fisheries subsidies, which were much more gradual and step by step, and more, you might say, I don't know, conciliatory, less adversive. It really depends a bit then also on the policy style. Yeah, and then I put this here on the role of transitional support. I said that earlier, it's not always pork for stakeholders. It can really be useful if you want to do something for the affected communities. So job training, buyouts, early retirement, etc., etc. There are a couple of international agreements around. I mentioned earlier that one of the, say, advantages of MEAs is that they provide a platform for these agreements, and I provided two examples here. The one is from the G20's Pittsburgh Summit, where they solemnly declared to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Unfortunately, there isn't a timeline there. I was a bit disappointed when I looked it up because I thought that there was a timeline, but there wasn't. There is a timeline, however, in the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity adopted by the CBD COP last year. So they say that by 2020 they want to eliminate, phase out, or reform incentives, including subsidies that are harmful for biodiversity. That's nice, huh? Consistent in harmony with the Convention and other relevant international obligations. That refers in particular to the WTO, because the WTO, under their Doha work program, also have a negotiating mandate on agricultural subsidy and fisheries subsidies. And taking into account national socio-economic conditions, that of course refers back to the genuine political considerations I mentioned a few minutes ago, development prerogatives, etc. This is meant to keep policy space for developing countries if they want to continue using fertilizer subsidies, for instance, to develop their agriculture. That's the idea. So, nevertheless, this is a quite useful commitment. Let's hope and let's work towards its effective implementation. Here's a bit like an outlook, right? What can we do short term and what can we do long term? As I said, the first step in many countries is actually to come up with some kind of transparent, comprehensive subsidy inventories and then do kind of an assessment of what their effects actually are, both on the environment side and then on the side of the stated objectives. Are they really effectual? Many of those presumably are not. And then you may come up with an action plan for prioritize phase out or reform and use political opportunities. There's one thing I forgot here, you need to put that. What's really helpful in many cases is actually transparency of public transparency on subsidy programs. It's immensely opposed by stakeholders, but the EU, for instance, had a regulation a couple of years ago that all member states have to come up with a public inventory of subsidies, including the recipients. And gee, some countries were really dragging their feet. And within the country's specific provinces, in my country, for instance, some provinces were really dragging their feet because they had important agricultural sectors, etc. So it helps a lot because it informs public debate. And if you know really what you're talking about and where the subsidies go, can have quite an impact on the political debate. Then in longer term, of course, there is the kind of a broader environmental fiscal reform agenda, reorient freed funds, for instance, for payments for ecosystem services, provision of funds to expand the protected area network, and investment in ecological infrastructure, restoration, ecosystem, large-scale ecosystem restoration. That would be the kind of the program for the future. Well, with that, I'm at the end of my talk. I mean, it's just reading the newspaper the last days. I mean, you would think that policymakers are more concerned about saving the euro or saving the banking system and the financial sector. But I would hope that this would come back to the agenda, even on the newspapers. So with that, thank you very much.